Hello, and welcome to Making Known the Unknown, Series 2, entitled Ignorance, the Mother of Devotion. Today, with me, are my guests, Sidney Schwartz. Welcome, Sidney. Sidney is a school teacher from Hackensack, New Jersey, and also a Bible researcher, as well as Reverend Hewitt. Carl is a medium and also founder and pastor of Gifts of the Spirit Church. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
And of course, I'm your host, Tina Tarryk, and welcome to all of you out there. Today's show will be a live show. It will be a 1-hour format. For those of you who may not be familiar with what we did last season, we had a 1 hour, actually a half hour previously recorded show, and we decided, because we had so much to share with all of you out there, that we would open up to a 1-hour live show. So at some point later on, I will be asking that the phone lines be open for those of you who may have questions that you might want to ask of Sidney or Carl on the topic for today. And the topic for today is Jesus and God. Those are big words. Those are big names. I decided to pick this topic for today because, as most of us go throughout our lives, we will see, especially in churches quite often, a very big focus on Jesus the Christ, or Jesus Christ. And many, many times myself, I will become confused as to whether Jesus is God or God is Jesus, simply because there's such a big focus on Jesus everywhere. And as some of you may know, in the Bible, of course, there were many, many people who performed many, many different, what we like to call gifts of the Spirit, or miracles, for those of you out there. And so this prompted me to ask today of our experts, what is the connection with Jesus and God, and why is it that we're all so focused on Jesus alone, at least in this country? And I guess I'll start with Sidney Schwartz, our Bible expert, or Bible guru, I like to call him. And welcome, Sidney, if you want to take a chunk out of that one.
Okay, that's a pretty big question there. Jesus came to the world in order to teach people about the gifts of the Spirit. That was his main mission, and he lived his life to educate people about the gifts of the Spirit. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, it says that he did not come to abolish the law or the prophets; he came to fulfill it. What he meant by that was that he came to demonstrate each and every one of the gifts of the Spirit. In biblical times, there was about 13 of the different gifts, and he was the only medium in the Bible who was able to perform all the gifts of the Spirit. He called it at one point that people only came to see him do these signs and miracles, or signs and wonders as he called it, and most of the people back then weren't as educated as we are today. They didn't have the scientific background, so Jesus wasn't really able to teach the sciences behind the gifts of the Spirit, although he had wanted to. And his life was cut short before he got to teach the gifts of the Spirit. So he was only able to demonstrate to them and try to get to get some of the people to understand what he was doing. But his disciples, he was a little bit more successful with, and he had 3 of his students that developed somewhat to his satisfaction.
Thank you. Now you're talking about Jesus like you'd be talking about any other man, any other human. So, in fact, Jesus was a man of flesh, of blood, like the rest of us.
In most of the places in the Bible, he calls himself the Son of Man.
Okay. Now, he taught the people, or tried to teach and show the people many of the different gifts that he was capable of. And you had mentioned they weren't quite as sophisticated, or I should say maybe scientific, as we are today.
Right.
So I'm guessing that this is maybe a point where, because of people's awe of what he could do, they tried to somehow remove him from the status of just a living human being. like the rest of us. And I'm not sure if that's where you think some of this began or started to turn him into an idol or an ideal of what everyone should be like. And maybe, Carl, you want to add something to that?
Well, as I have said before, in the other dimensions beyond this one that we're in, there are many dimensions, many, many dimensions. There's a dimension for every person that lives on the earth plane. And Jesus came from one of the very high dimensions. He would have been titled an ascended master. In other words, he knew everything. He was very knowledgeable. He knew how to perform the gifts of the Spirit, which he demonstrated, and it was the phenomena of what he created that they call miracles. And it was because of that that his reputation spread, and the people started following him around, leaving the priest back there, because don't forget, as I have said before, the priest had a following, and their following took care of them. They supported them in money and food and everything else like that. So Jesus was really a threat to them. That's all there was to it. This is why they got together and had him destroyed. But you see, up to that point, he had only demonstrated the gifts of the Spirit. And he said to the people, what you see me do, you can do, even greater things shall you do. He said that simply because he was able to do remote viewing. He saw the future. He saw people becoming more educated and understanding the gifts of the Spirit, see? And so he came back here to teach us the gifts of the Spirit. That was what it was all about. And but he was such a threat to the priest that they ganged up on him and had him killed. After he died, going into the other dimension, he decided to select a prophet, a gifted person, and this is where Saul comes in. And the church changed his name to Paul, and they canonized him as a saint, you see. But Jesus was a prophet. The Jewish people still says today that he was a prophet. They don't look at him as if he was God, but he was no different than the ordinary person, except he did have all the gifts of the Spirit. And he had those gifts even before he came here.
Thank you. Now, so why do you suppose it seems, at least in this country, in this culture, we focus so much on Jesus because he could perform some of these miracles as a prophet? Were there not other prophets in history throughout time that are mentioned in the Bible that could perform other types of miracles? And I guess I would turn this over to you, Sidney.
Well, Elijah was a prophet in the Old Testament, and was referred to as a prophet. And he heals people. He brought people back to life from the dead. He created apports, which is multiplying the food for the widow. He also ascended, just like Jesus did. So he did some of the very same things that Jesus did. Yet there aren't any churches or synagogues even that are named after Elijah, like you see for Jesus, all the time. Elisha was the student of Elijah, and it was the same thing. Elisha also raised someone from the dead and reports, and it's the same thing. He was doing some of the same quote miracles that Jesus did, but yet nobody calls Elisha a god. Jesus himself did not call himself a prophet. We've prepared a short videotape of a short clip of a Bible verse that actually Jesus is referring to himself as a prophet.
Really?
Yeah, so if we could have that video clip now.
Thank you. If you could run that clip for us and our viewers.
Matthew chapter 13, verses 57 and 58 read, "But Jesus said unto them, A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and in his own house. And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief." The Greek word for miracles has been translated many different ways in the 200 different New Testaments. Some examples are acts of powers, good works, great works, mighty deeds, miracles, miraculous works, powerful deeds, powers, supernatural deeds, which would indicate that it was psychic phenomena, wonders, works of power. It is interesting that according to traditional Christian theology, Jesus was God. This is what enabled him to change the water into wine, walk on water, multiply the loaves and the fishes, and heal the sick. So if Jesus were God, why would the negative thoughts of the people of Nazareth have any effect upon his ability to perform miracles? This verse provides the evidence that Jesus was a medium whose psychic ability could not always compete with negative thought energy.
Thank you. That's very interesting. You researched many different versions of the Bible,
Yes,
as
about
is your forte.
About 200 New Testaments, yes.
And you've seen that many times he is spoken of in the sense that he is godlike almost, and maybe correct me if I'm missing out on the intent of that.
Well, basically, he was telling his students that, and the people there, that he was a prophet, because he was saying that in most places a prophet can go all around the countryside, and people flock to see him or her, and because they want the information from the other dimension, because the prophet acts as a medium, bringing information from the other dimension to this dimension, and sometimes it's through the acts that they do, such as apports or healings or things that all originate from the we call it the world of spirit, or some people would call it heaven, and it be demonstrated that way. So he was saying that you could go from town to town, and everybody flocks to see the prophet. But when the prophet goes to his own hometown, people just think that he's a little boy. You remember him as a little boy, before he developed everything, and they don't have any respect for him. And this is what the message he was saying there. And because they had negative thoughts about his abilities, he couldn't do any of the gifts of the Spirit at that particular time. So what we're trying to point out there is that since the traditional Christian thinks that Jesus is God, then people's thoughts shouldn't affect whether he can multiply the food or anything at any given time, because God's supposedly omnipotent, all-powerful, can do whatever he wants at any particular time. So what effect would mere thought have on the creator of the universe? Wouldn't really have any. So this is really showing that because he couldn't do the, quote, miracles or the gifts of the Spirit because of the people's thought, that he was really a medium or a prophet. The biblical term is a prophet, and today's term is a medium.
Thank you. So then if he were a god of a sort, then of course with the crucifixion, he would have been able to stop that from happening, perhaps?
Sure.
Wouldn't have allowed himself to have gone through all the different stations of the cross and all of the torturous events that occurred. You would think that if that were the case, we wouldn't have seen representations of the stigmata or some of the other things that we've seen portrayed. What is your take on this?
Well, prior to him going through the crucifixion and all that suffering and that horrible death he went through, he was told by two great prophets, Moses and Elijah, when they materialized on the mountain, only for his three advanced students, Peter, James, and John, to witness that so they would take that on to the rest of the world. If a person like when he appeared to me in 1997, and I'm talking about Jesus himself, because he proved it who he was because of the pictures that came through. And he said for me to tell the people not to wait for him because he didn't go anywhere to have to come back. He says, I am living, I am in the world of spirit, which is where everybody goes when they die, unless they're ready to come back in another body. So he was a great teacher. That's all he was. And he communicated with the other dimension. He said to the people, he tried to get that message across, and it's surprising to me that more people don't read that and understand it. He said, know that ye are gods, which means God is within all of us, and that there is no big man up there somewhere or other controlling us.
So now you realize, of course, that a lot of people who have gone through their lives thinking that I have to be good, I have to do this, I have to do that, because at some point at the end of this physical life, I'm going to be judged.
By themselves.
Jesus taught that judge ye not, lest ye be judged.
Judge
So
not.
if he was saying that himself, why would he judge other people?
At the end of a person's life, immediately after they die, it's like everything they ever did. It's like running that tape backwards so that we can see it again. Everything they ever did, because everything that we've done from birth to death is recorded in our soul. It's called soul memory, and it stays there. And we judge ourselves, just as one of the entities that has spoken to me in the past many times. Like I've said before, in your presence, if you know you back in the stove and burn your behind, you are going to sit on the blister. Nobody else will do it for you, you see? So there is no judgment, because when he says, judge not lest ye be judged, if a person judges another person, the judging is recorded in their soul, and they wind up being judged for that at another time.
I'd like the audience to think about this. In the book of John, it's chapter 8, I believe, there's a situation where there's an adulteress, and she was caught, and she's about to be stoned. And Jesus is there, and he wants to help this woman out. And he doesn't quite know what he'd do. And the Bible says that he stoops down, and he writes in the ground with his finger. What he was doing there was automatic writing, which we talked about before, where spirit takes the hand of the person and writes. So he was writing in the dirt, and in the dirt it said, "Let he without sin be the one to cast the stone." So that was the message from the spirit world that Jesus repeated and stopped the situation. When it was all done, he simply said to the woman, "Go home and don't sin anymore." He didn't judge her. He didn't say that she committed terrible sins, or that she had to do acts of contrition, or had to go to a priest and beg for forgiveness. He just said, don't sin anymore. He didn't judge her. He had if he believed in judgment, that was a perfect opportunity for him to do it at that point. But he didn't. It shows his philosophy on the matter.
You would think that, right, if he had seen somebody who was doing something less than good, if he were really a god, he would have zapped them, for lack of a better expression,
Sure.
and disintegrated them on the spot. But evidently this woman was, like you said, told to go home, and we don't know probably what happened after that, but she probably just chose not to perform those acts anymore of her own free will.
When we read the story of Jesus with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, they're having a long conversation, and there again, he asks her to go home to ask her husband something, and she says she doesn't have a husband, and he says, "You're right in saying that you don't have a husband. You've lived with 5 men, and none of them have been your husband." He didn't again judge her about living, quote, living in sin, living with a man without being the benefit of marriage. He didn't say that at all, and her response was, "I see you are a prophet." She knew right away that she was talking to a prophet. She didn't say, "I'm talking to God." She said, "I see that you're a prophet." During Jesus' life, he was considered a prophet. It was only after his death and several hundred years later that they decided to turn him into a god. And that basically occurred at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325.
Before we dive into that, because I know you brought a clip with you, Sidney, what are we all afraid of? What are we living with day to day, every minute of every hour? Because I can tell you that I'm not really the most religious person, but yet somewhere, somehow, in the back of my mind, there's still this notion that we have to perform well in this lifetime, because at some point we will be judged. And you know, when you walk into your average church, there's almost a sense of fear, but it's you know, maybe borderline between fear and respect for lack of knowing any better. And you don't certainly want to say anything unkind in a church. You don't want to do this in a church. You don't want to do that in a church. Of course, when you leave the church, you do your best to be a good citizen, a good person, and then eventually it will fade out until you come back around and partake in a church service again. what are we afraid of? What is going on out there that, I mean, we talked about why Jesus has more or less been turned into a god, but why is it that there has to be that notion of someone or something else opposing
Because of the
you?
boogeyman.
Because of the boogeyman. What do you mean by that, Carl?
The devil. There is no such thing as the devil.
Oh,
That was my first question when I realized, when he identified himself, and I realized who it was I was talking to, I said, I want to know one thing right up front. Is there such a thing as the devil? And he said, no, there is no. It was created. They started creating it in the year 3025.
325.
Huh?
325.
325.
Yeah.
Yes.
And 325 happened to also be the same year where a very famous group of people,
Yeah.
priests,
Yes,
Yes.
bishops,
and
yes.
bishops,
Bishops.
got together.
Yes, 318 of them traveled to Nicaea
Okay.
to meet with Constantine, who was the Roman emperor at
And
the
the
time.
purpose was for what?
The purpose was that Constantine wanted to create a unified dogma within the Catholic Church, Christian Church at that time, because in different areas of the Roman Empire, they had different traditions. And some of the places didn't call Jesus God. They thought that he was created. He was the Son of God and created after God. Therefore, he couldn't be made up of the same substance as God, and that caused a whole big conflict back then. So he had just brought together the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. He was ruling both halves because for a long time there were two emperors. Now he was ruling both, and he wanted to unify it, and he wanted to use religion as a unifying base. So he wanted everybody to be converted to Catholicism, and they all had to have one belief.
Okay, so this is the foundation for the clip that we're about to see that you've brought.
Yes.
And for those of the viewers out there who are watching us, after we run this clip, I'm going to be opening up the phone lines should you decide that there are some questions you'd like to direct to Reverend Hewitt or Mr. Sidney Schwartz with respect to our topic today. And I'll let you know what that number is after we run the clip. Thank you.
In April of 2001, Carl and I traveled to Turkey to do research for our next book. Nancy Hennigan traveled with us. Our first stop was Istanbul, where we visited the typical tourist attractions. The Blue Mosque is one of the most prominent landmarks of Istanbul. Sultan Ahmed I commissioned the construction of the Blue Mosque in 1609. It was completed in 1616. It is very impressive with its beautiful domes and semi-domes, nice courtyards, and 6 slender minarets. The building is nearly a square and covered with a dome 77 feet in diameter and 140 feet high. There are 4 colossal standing columns of 16.3 feet in diameter, which give the basic support to the building. The mosque has 260 windows that allow the sunlight to softly diffuse into the building. Constantinople was Istanbul's original name, because Emperor Constantine founded the city in 330 AD. Hagia Sophia was completed in 537 and was the world's largest church for the next 1,000 years. Its most prominent feature was its gigantic dome. In 1453, Constantinople was captured by Islamic invaders, and Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, and the 4 minarets were added. The building has several breathtaking mosaics of religious figures. And of course, no trip to Istanbul would be complete without a stop at the world-famous bazaar, where all types of Turkish crafts can be purchased. The next city we visited was Nicaea, which lies east of Constantinople on the continent of Asia. Since Nicaea is located on a shore of a sea which has direct access to the Mediterranean Sea, it was the perfect location for the first international council of the Christian Church. Theologians from all over the Roman Empire came to this council. In 324, Constantine had just become emperor of both the eastern and western half of the Roman Empire. In 325, he convened this council at Nicaea to unify the divergent branches of the Christianity. As we walked along the banks of the sea, we came to the meager remains of Constantine's seaside mansion, where the council was held. Carl went into an altered state and began describing the vision he was seeing of the theologians disembarking from their boats and entering the grand mansion.
There's a big tree there. That big tree, that's a big tree.
Yeah.
And here, this small one here is another branch off of another old big tree.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
That's that old big one. See the big one standing there?
Okay, I forget. Thank you. Thank you, Sidney. Wow. So you've gone so far, both of you, as to travel to different parts of the world to get some answers to some very, very big questions. It's very interesting to know the history of what was going on at that time in Constantinople with the emperor, the new emperor, and to remember that politics played a part then as it does now with a lot of things that are going on.
Yes, exactly.
With the church. I'm particularly interested to hear from Carl, because you had mentioned that Carl had gone into a trance while he was there on the spot. That was
Yes.
the spot of where
The council took place, yes.
the original council did in 325
Yes.
BC?
AD.
AD. Interesting. And if you would, Carl, if you could share with us, if you can, some of what you picked up on when you were in that spot.
Well, when I went in the trance state, they took me back, because you see, even before we left to go there, I was having my doubts about a lot of things. There was so much I was reading that I didn't accept. And then when Jesus appeared to me and he said who he was, because I had been talking for a long time, said, you know, I would appreciate it if you would tell me who you are. And he said, it's not important. And finally he said, I will identify myself, and he did through those precipitated pictures. And so when we made our plans and we went there, I went into the altered state of consciousness. In other words, I went into a trance, and they took me back to that time. And it was a bad experience for me, because there was a lot of fighting, fist fighting, and you name it among those men, because there was two of them they murdered, because there was something that these two men wanted in the book of books, and these other men did not want it in there. And they killed those two guys. There was blood all over the place. It was a bad experience for me.
So you mean to tell me these people who we hold in high esteem at that time in the world
The
came from
bishops.
all over the place, and they actually fought each other physically?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it was a bloodbath at one point.
Absolutely. Sid can tell you the rest of the story, because I don't even know where I was or anything about it. I know that when I came out of this trance, our bus was creeping along the curb, and I went into that other time. I went way back in time.
Thank you.
And that's very possible for a medium to do. A medium can sometimes go into the future, which is remote viewing, and they can also go in the past. It was a bad experience. I didn't want that, but it happened because I was in denial of some of this stuff. And so I think he could pick up on that.
You have to remember that thoughts is energy, and when events happen, and that energy of people's thoughts gets at that place. And a medium who's sensitive to this, when they go to a place of historic value that's charged with some kind of emotion, whether it be positive emotion or negative emotion, can instantly tune into that energy and relive that exactly what happened. It's almost for them like watching the videotape of what went on. At the Council of Nicaea, there was a man, a priest called Arius, and he was from Alexandria. And it was his belief that Jesus was the creation of the Father, and that he wasn't alive when this initially. In other words, that Jesus was the Son of God. That was what this man believed. But the Bishop of Alexandria thought that was heresy, because he said that, as it says in the Bible in certain places, that Jesus was the Word and existed eternally with the Father and was divine and could not be created. So this was the big issue of the day, whether Jesus was of the same made up of the same essence as God, or if he came after God and was created by God. And so they got so mad at Arius that they called this heresy, because they wanted to make Jesus divine, and they wanted him to be almost like a co-God with the creator of the universe, and therefore the idea that he came afterwards or was created by God, was the Son of God, became heresy, and they actually murdered him at this council.
They murdered him.
Yes.
Now, you found this out through your research.
Yes.
So this is something that was written that everyone else can go out and find and read if they wanted to.
Yes.
Okay. So for some of us who aren't necessarily mediums, that don't have the gift that Carl has, the information's available.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sure there are many people out there who are skeptics who might say, okay, Carl, you said this, but how do we know for sure? How do we know that this is real? However, Carl, you had said yourself that you were driven on a quest to have questions answered and that you'd had doubts.
That's right.
And in fact, as a result of that, Sidney was able to find some of those answers.
Right. It occurred to me today as we were going over our notes for the show today that there's really a dramatic contradiction in the Bible, because if what Arius said was heresy, that Jesus really wasn't the Son of God, that he existed at the same time that God existed, then how come in John 3:16, which is a very famous verse, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish and have eternal life." How could he be begotten if begotten would indicate there's lots of people that were begotten here through the normal natural means. Right. So if they're saying that God begot Jesus, then he couldn't be of the same essence as God. It couldn't have been created at the beginning of time like God was, and contradicts the Christian theology, because the Nicene Creed, which was written at the Council of Nicaea, says that Jesus was the same as God and always existed. He was the Word, as it says in the New Testament. So that verse, which is quoted so much, really is contradicting what their theology is.
So this is the point at where they were deciding whether Jesus was forever to be considered God, one and the same, or in fact separate. I guess we could all probably guess which side won.
Right. It was also the time that I've read also other accounts of the Council of Nicaea that these 318 bishops that came to this council all brought their Bibles with them, and their Bibles again were not exactly, today we go to Bible's more or less the same. If you get the same version, it'll read the same. But back then there were differences within them, and this was some of the other things they were trying to iron out, was to come up with a more authorized text of the Bible.
So they combined their versions of what they called the Bible, or their attempt was to do that, on behalf of the Roman Empire?
They started that, yes, but actually what happened was they didn't get too far with the whole process, because they had so many the things to discuss that Pope Damius later on in the 390s commissioned Jerome to retranslate the Bible into Latin, because there were different Latin versions, and he was the one that came up with the authorized Vulgate text. So
we would call that the quote-unquote original Bible, and there were no Bibles before that?
No, there were Bibles before that, but basically he was making the official version, the one the church wanted.
Okay.
And they were editing words here and there. While we were at Nicaea, and on this trip, there were several cases where Carl was given the exact original way that Jesus taught things, which is different than what's in the book. If you want to talk about many mansions.
Oh, yes.
Before we get into that, Carl, if you could hold that thought, what I wanted to do, and I promised this for our viewers before, that I would open up the phone lines. We are now going to go live for all of you out there who might be in on this very blustery Saturday and would like to ask questions of Reverend Hewitt and Mr. Schwartz with respect to our topic today, Jesus and God. And I am sure many of you out there have questions, just like all of us do. And as a result of some of these questions, these two gentlemen have spent many, many years and time finding out those answers with all the resources that they have. And if any of you would like to share your thoughts or find out if you can have any questions answered, perhaps, you're welcome to do that. And our open phone line is 1728, and we will be live until 1:30. And when you call in, please let us know your name and your question. Okay, Carl, if you could continue with that. We were talking about something to do with many mansions in the Bible.
Okay, Jesus told the people at the time, he says, in my Father's house are many dimensions. That was changed. They changed that because they didn't know what dimensions were. They changed it, in my Father's house are many mansions, simply because they were in a mansion, that meeting that took place in Nicaea. That was in a huge mansion there. That's where we went. We were there at the site of where that mansion was. And so when I went into this altered state, I was actually in the mansion at the time that all this meeting was taking place. So he had told the people, and of course that was written down somewhere or other, and they changed it from dimensions to mansions. And as I have taught all of my students, when we leave here, when we go through death, the moment that the heart stops, it gives birth to the spirit body. Well, you go into into John chapter 4, where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan, and he's talking about many things to her. She's becoming educated by him since he's a prophet, you see. And he mentioned there that you people, he's talking to this woman now, you people worship what you don't even know, while we, I find that interesting because nobody ever picks up on it, while we worship what we understand, what we know. Now he uses the term we. Why would, if he was God, why would he worship himself?
Right.
You understand me?
Right.
But he had taught prior to that God is within ourselves. So when the heart does stop, it gives birth to the spirit body, and the spirit body goes to a dimension just like we have created here on the earth plane.
Okay.
Exactly that way.
So you were mentioning that the Bible was changed.
It was.
Even as early as 325.
Yes.
A lot of changes taking place in that Bible.
You know, that lends me to believe, and perhaps other people out there, that if it took this much research and lives and time in your lives to find this out, what other things have been changed? What other things have been switched around? Of course, that could be an entirely other show, and we could get into at a later point. But that to me, it just lends itself to more doubt around the Bible, or versions of the Bible, or different cultures that claim to have their own Bible written for themselves.
You know, it's interesting, Tina, that when we were in Turkey, we were in this museum, and our tour guide said something that really brought me up short. And he was talking about the fact we were looking at this edition of the Quran that went back, I think, about 1,000 years. And he said to us, the original editions of the Quran have disappeared. Well, the original versions of the Bible have disappeared too. The original Old Testament's not around, and the original New Testament is not around either. We just have things that are like, I think the oldest the oldest Old Testament is from the year 900 A.D. Remember, this is a book that's dealing with everything that happened before Jesus, and the New Testament also is like 2nd or 3rd century. It's after all these councils, and when they started to work this, there's nothing that goes back before that, so that we really don't know what the originals really said. And it's the same thing with Islam. The other interesting thing with Islam, to make a comparison, they also got their knowledge from a prophet, Muhammad, and they do not view Muhammad as God. They in their faith they specifically said that Allah is God and Muhammad is his prophet. He was the one bringing the message through, and they have a very clear understanding of mediumship. But that was all muddied up with Christianity, because they turned the medium into the God.
Once again, in another culture.
Yes.
And the benefit of that would be, for what? For what purpose? To turn prophets into gods.
Control.
Control. Carl is saying control.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And they need to control the people because Money, okay. I'm getting a money signal here from Carl.
Yep.
Okay, all right. All right, so we're really coming to a conclusion here that there's a benefit in doing this in many areas. Naturally, one of the questions that comes up, and of course this is a big question, and perhaps this could encompass another show. What, to your understanding and liking, is God? And I don't know who wants to volunteer on that one first.
Let me put it this way. God is the source, the is, the light.
The I am.
The I am. It's everything, everything, everything. There is no man, big man,
Okay.
sitting out there on a throne waiting to judge us. And there is no devil that's going to punish us. We punish ourselves. Remember the the statement about the burning your behind on the stove? You sit on the blister yourself.
Yes, we do.
Because I ask him to please explain this thing to me, because with the work I do, I have been called many times and said that this is the work of the devil. And he cleared that up. He said, there is no such thing as the devil. And this is what he said, and this is for all of your listeners, all your viewers. He said, if there was God, and God created heaven and earth and everything in between, then he created all the people on the planet, all the animals on the planet. He had to create the devil if there was such a person. And since this entity, God, has the ability to take life away or give life, why doesn't he zap that blinkety-blank person and get rid of them, get them off the planet once and for all? And he stressed, if people would only think, he says, all the people have a brain, they all have a mind, but he says, I see so very few people using it. And he came down very strong with those words to me. And he says, the first gathering in your teaching, and because I wanted to know, why are you selecting me to do this? He says, because you've always asked questions, and we have given you the answers. And he said, tell the people not to wait for me because I'm not returning, because I didn't go anywhere to return. He says, I'm in spirit, and I'm watching everything that goes on.
So there's no second coming?
He's already been here. I mean, he's
Okay.
already came.
Okay.
It's just like one of the people over there said that he's waiting for the second coming, and I mean, he's waiting for the first coming, whereas so many people are waiting for the second coming.
Okay.
And
So he's very much alive in the dimension that he's in.
he's as much alive as my father is, and my father came back 12 years after he died. My mother came back a couple of days after she died. She gave me a bad time. I almost said she gave me help, but she gave me a bad time because of something that I didn't do just right. And this is going on for as long as we have any record of the civilization here on the planet. Now, there was a great, I know nobody asked me this, but one of the great mediums of all time lived right here in this city. She was a friend of mine. We traveled around from one spiritualist church to the other, and she lived on the highest peak over here. Her house, look right out the window and you see right on down the river towards New London. She was a wonderful medium, trance medium at that.
Really?
This is why we had so much in common. And she passed, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, Calesta Rita, and I'm sure somebody watching this program would recognize that name. She was a fabulous medium. She hated that word psychic just like I do. And she was a great medium. And she went with me to a haunted house not too far from here, too. And we got rid of the spirit people that was still locked into that vibration.
You mentioned vibration. That would be the same thing as dimension to some degree.
Yes.
We're talking about the same term.
Different
Okay.
vibration.
So what's this woman's name again? Tell me.
Calesta Rita.
Calesta Rita.
Yeah.
Okay. For those of our viewers out there who may have known this woman,
Yes.
are familiar with her works, or again have a question for Reverend Hewitt and Mr. Sidney Schwartz, make sure you give us a call, 889-1728. We'll be live again, still for another 15 minutes or so. Don't be shy. You'd be surprised when you start out with a very innocent question that you might open your mind. You might touch upon something new. You might learn something from this program.
It might be the same question that other people are wondering about, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, we touched upon God a little bit, too. And then I still had something left over in my mind from Jesus. And I had written down some notes here that I wanted to ask you both about. And of course, when most of us walk into churches, we see a statue of Jesus. And most often, all the time, we see a cross, with or without Jesus on the cross. We see people wearing crosses for jewelry, for earrings. They have them on walls in their homes. Is that just another form of idealization that no longer applies?
Let me jump in here.
Okay.
He told me in that session back there about 4 years ago, he said that he went through a horrible death, and ever since then, he has not had one moment of peace, not one moment of peace, because of the billions of people all over the planet that call out his name every moment of every day, wanting help. Help me with this and help me with that and heal this and heal that. And he said, if they only knew what you know, and I'm not bragging by saying I knew it, because he taught me that God is within, and if we turn within and ask the Lord God of your being to come forward and heal the body, the temple of spirit. In other words, when I go to bed at night, I say, Lord God of my being, unto the Father within, come forward this moment, this hour, and heal my body, your temple. He said the human body is the greatest temple of the living God that was ever created. He says, not cathedrals, not any of these buildings. He said, I taught my students, and they didn't understand me either. He said, just like a lot of your students don't understand. Because all of these things you just mentioned is only an image, only an image.
So wearing a cross, praying to Jesus and always asking him to help you isn't necessarily going to solve your problem.
He told me something else about the cross, too. He said that the very people that wear a cross around their neck all the time, he said they were the same kind of people that shouted, crucify him, back there 2,000 years ago. He said they're just as guilty, because that's when I told my people, if you have a cross in your house with him on it, get rid of it. If you got to have a cross, get one without his body. I mean, like I told him one time, I shook up a lot of people. I said, suppose that he was killed the way some of the Jewish people were killed in World War II. I said, you're going to walk around with a little oven hung around your neck? You know, if he was put in the oven and gassed, that shook up a lot of the people.
I think that would shake up a lot of people watching this show right now. There are more people that I can think of that I find all the time wearing crosses, and I honestly think most of them do it with good intent.
Yes,
but
they
for
do.
lack of knowledge.
Yes.
And that ties into, again, the title of this series, which is Ignorance, the Mother of Devotion.
He said use anything you can use to get people to use their own brain and their own mind. He said this is something all other people have, but he said they don't use it. So
we can't just lay back and entrust in
That's right. We have to do
a
our
God
part.
up in heaven or Jesus, wherever he is, to take care of our problems. Okay. We do have a caller on the line. Hello, caller.
Yes, this is for Carl.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your name, caller?
My name is Paul.
Paul? Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, I'd like to know what age that Carl to see things, and can younger adults or younger children be able to see things or listen to things in their head?
Everybody, if I understand his call, everybody to some extent has the gift of clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is able to see. Clairaudience is able to hear voices. Many children come into the world with these gifts, many. But the unfortunate thing is so many adults will say, well, that's your imagination, and eventually that part of the brain of the child shuts down and the child does not hear voices anymore. It's a very sad thing. I see it all the time.
One more question. Do you feel that children sometimes might draw what might be a question in their head and maybe want to ask a question to an adult and is afraid?
Yes, it happens all the time, sir. Are you referring to one of your children?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure which one it is. I'm not picking up on it. I'm picking up on voice vibration with you. There's one of your children that's very gifted because the child was in another life in Naples, Italy. The child was a very gifted child at the time. It was a little girl. It was a girl, a woman in that time. She lived on the upper portion of that city. Evidently, there's a portion of that city that's high up on the mountain or the hill, and that's where she lived. But she was not accepted by the family, and especially the church in that area in that time.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, caller.
The other thing I wanted to add is a lot of times children have what people call imaginary playmates.
Yeah.
And most of the time they're really spirit people that they're seeing, and it's not part of their imagination at all.
That's interesting. So the caller had a question specific to Carl being a medium and his abilities to see all of these things. And of course, the combination of Carl's gift and your research together is very powerful. And there's a lot, I think, that we can offer our viewers with that. I think we have another caller. Go ahead, caller.
Okay, hold on a second.
Go ahead, caller.
Oh, hi.
What's your name?
Lola. I was just wondering, I called last week.
Oh, hi, Lola.
Hi. I was just wondering if I could get a medium.
I'm sorry, did you want to speak to Carl?
Yeah, if you could tell me a reading.
Lola, if you have a brief question for Mr. Hewitt, he'd be glad to answer.
Oh, no, I didn't have a question this week. I was just wondering because the last guy that called had the reading.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
He was answering a question. Well, if you have a specific question, we're really not doing readings. That's not the purpose of the show, but you're welcome to ask a question.
Okay, no, I don't have any question.
Okay, thank you for calling.
Thanks.
Okay. Many people are, of course, very interested in speaking to you, Carl, and having a lot of questions answered for themselves and their personal lives. And we, of course, hope that this show will be a way that they can do that. So if you viewers out there have a very specific question, we'd be glad to help you. So perhaps if you can formulate that ahead of time before calling 889-1728, we'd be glad to hone in on the answer for you with that.
Perhaps in some of the future shows that I would be willing to do some, as they call it, mini readings.
Okay, thank you.
But right now I'm more interested in getting people to open their minds and think for themselves and realize that this is nothing to do with some evil being somewhere or other. It's something, it's the gifts of the Spirit, something that's been here forever.
So we were last talking about, you'd made a comparison with the Holocaust with respect to the horrendous things that happened to people there, and the symbol of an oven, and how in many ways that is similar possibly to what happened with Jesus on the cross, and wearing crosses.
It was a horrible death.
So in wearing crosses, we really aren't doing anything to honor him, and maybe we think we are.
It's not honoring him.
It's not.
No.
Okay. And as you said, he has been in communication with you and has told you that he hasn't had a moment of rest.
Not a moment of rest in all of his life.
And I can imagine, I mean, even in my life, without knowing, just like sometimes I'll point upwards to the sky and refer to God or heaven, sometimes I will also use his name.
But let me explain
it won't
something.
help.
That means a higher rate of vibration.
Okay.
Doesn't mean up in the sky. Has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
And he has tried to use a lot of people to teach this on the planet, but there's none of them that is willing to do this because they think that this is somebody, it's a devil impersonating Jesus. You understand? Mm-hmm. When I said, I want you to prove it to me, and it was proven to me. The voice is still the same. But there were some things that he told me that happened. I had to go hiking in the woods to digest it. It was so heavy, especially when he said that, talked about the horrible death that he had to go through. And he still felt sorry for the people while he was on the cross. I asked him about that, and he said, because of their ignorance, he said they could not understand. And he explained the time that he was turning over the tables for the change makers, you know, the money exchangers. And he was trying to explain that there were two paths in life. One path was the path of God, and the other one was the path of humanity. And his students couldn't understand that, so he got angry with all those change makers and turned their tables over and everything else. And then when they caught up with him that night, that is the students, and they questioned him, you know, Master, that was a terrible thing you did. And he said, well, I'm trying to explain to you the difference between what God can do and what man can do. Mm. And he says, there's just two paths in life. You either go either way.
And to go on the path, or the God-like path,
yeah.
or the path of God, what we would do, what we should be doing is what? Allowing,
loving, not hating, not judging any of this.
Okay. So it's a similar message, but we ourselves are coming to that conclusion, or we ourselves are helping ourselves get there. We're not using a church, we're not using a priest, we're not using a statue, we're not using a symbol of a cross to be worn. We can do it ourselves.
I simply feel sorry for all the people that have been misled on this planet, including my own family, because I was an outcast simply because I heard voices and saw visions, and all these strange things were happening to me.
Similar as maybe Jesus was an outcast in his own town,
exactly.
as Sidney was referring to.
Absolutely.
Okay. For those of you out there, we might have time for one more call. If you had a question with respect to Jesus or God with Reverend Hewitt or Sidney Schwartz. And one final comment that I had for viewers is that this show, we realize, can be very heavy for some of you and very difficult initially to absorb. And what we'll ask at a minimum for all of you is to just think about it.
Yes.
Think about it by yourself.
Reason it out.
Okay.
Reason it out.
Good. Reason it out. And as we go on in this season with this series of shows coming up, give us a call. Don't hesitate to do that. We'd be happy to hear from you. No question is a bad question. No question is a stupid question, as some of you might have heard when you were growing up. You'll be surprised what you will learn. And with that, I will wrap up the show for today. Many, many thanks to Sidney Schwartz and Reverend Carl Hewitt.
Thank you.
And we thank you, viewers.